Well, first of all, I think we have to start out with the idea that the understanding of the other side is highly imbalanced. So when Deng took over in '78 and began reform and opening up, the first conclusion he reached, which was fundamentally sound, was that because of the history of China and what China went through in the 19th and 20th centuries, that China missed its industrial revolution. The industrial revolution hit the US roughly in 1870. China did not begin its industrial revolution until roughly 1980 under Deng. So one of the things Deng realized from the very beginning was that China had to make a massive effort to catch up to the West in manufacturing and technology. So one of the first things he did was to say, we want as many of our best educated students to be educated in the West and learn as much from the West as they can. So as an example, at any point in time, there are roughly 600,000 Chinese students in America. The number of Americans studying at universities in China is probably less than 10,000. 26 million people from China have visited the US. Less than 1 million people from the US have ever visited China. Now, this should not be surprising, because if you go back to the Qing dynasty and before, there was no interest in China in learning anything about the West. It was viewed as the barbaric part of the world, and so the notion was, we are the Middle Kingdom, we are at the forefront of knowledge and sophistication, and therefore there's nothing to be learned from the West. So you could argue that since America became the leading global country in 1870, we've had 150 years where we have been the undisputed global leader in terms of economics and the military. So just as China, when it was #1, had very little interest in the rest of the world, it's not surprising that Americans have relatively little interest in the rest of the world. But the reality is, China is now the dominant country in the East, and Asia is the fastest growing part of the world, just as the US is the dominant country in the West. So especially the younger generation, I think, realize that understanding China is going to become increasingly important to understanding the world. So when I've given talks at many universities, the young people respond extremely well because they're genuinely intellectually curious about what's going on in China and why, and have a real thirst for learning. I think the more senior or older people in America grew up under the Cold War, where it was US versus Russia, where the enemy was always communism. And so because China is a communist-dominated country, I think the feeling for many Americans is they're always going to be different, and therefore we should always be suspicious of them. Well, I think one of the misconceptions, I think many people think of China as a threat in America. Many Americans think of China as the enemy. But it's very important to draw a distinction between two different dimensions. When you use the word threat, most people think of it as military threat. The reality is China has about the most peaceful record of any large country in the world over the last 1,000 years. China's defense budget is 1/3 of the US defense budget, even though it has 4 times as many people. The US has spent over $10 trillion in current dollar terms since 9/11 on the war on terror. So factually, you cannot look at the track record of the US and China and conclude that China, based on its history, is a military threat. The other thing is, you go back to Confucian values, which are still incredibly important in China. Harmony and balance are the 2 watchwords. And if you are harmonious and balanced and especially pragmatic, which is another feature of the Chinese, war is an enormous waste of money, not only in human terms, but also in economic terms. So the Chinese, I believe, have no interest in spreading their model anywhere else in the world. And almost all of their international activities have one simple objective in mind, and that is to strengthen the Chinese economy so that the standard of living of Chinese can improve. And that explains to me what they did in Africa. It explains what they're doing with One Belt, One Road. It explains what they've done in trade over the years. You know, people talk a lot about China being unfair in trade. We have to remember that China was simply following an agreed-to trade treaty between the U.S. and China. Now, you could say in retrospect that we negotiated in America a bad deal. That may be true, but we can't call China unfair because they basically were taking advantage of the liberal terms that the Americans allowed. And the same thing's true on intellectual property theft. The reality is any company in the world that competes against a primary competitor is always in the process of trying to figure out what their secrets are. And the same is true of governments. So while the US focuses on China having taken the intellectual property, we have to remember that we did very little to protect that property. And if it was that important to us in retrospect, we should have. And the parallel is that in the US Industrial Revolution, there were spies in Washington who were hired basically to go to Europe and steal the secrets of the most advanced industrial countries in Europe, namely France, England, and Germany. So we did exactly the same thing, but we criticized the Chinese while ignoring the fact that they're doing nothing more than what we did before. Well, I would start by saying I'm not sure there are many people, and certainly not the president in Washington, who are listening. So I think they've staked out some very clear positions, and I think pride is going to lead them to stick to those positions over time, even though the facts increasingly are on the other side. What could change it is that America is shaped by its corporates. And so I think increasingly US businesses are coming back and saying tariffs are hurting us. It's going to result in a decline in our GDP growth. It's going to result in an increase in unemployment. Everybody understands that. And could I imagine an administration coming in that was much more sympathetic to that point of view? Yes, I can. Will they embrace China as a partner? Probably not. But certainly they'll move away from the self-defeating tariff policy that we've seen today.